Hello, so welcome again everybody to this BAFTSS Horror Studies weekday night bites event. And tonight we're talking about female horror authorship, and we're really pleased. So I'm here with my co-conveners of the BAFTSS Horror Studies SIG, Shellie and Kate. And we had a meeting yesterday and we were talking about how fantastic it was that we started the SIG almost exactly a year ago. Actually, I looked earlier and I think we're just 2 weeks shy of our first anniversary. And our very first event last September was the launch of Alison's book Women Make Horror, which is obviously fantastic. I have a bias in a minute, but you know, it's a good book. And we're finishing up. This is our last event for this academic year, so we're a little bit tired and emotional, but very much looking forward. Very much looking forward to this event. I'm really pleased that we can bookend such a successful year in the SIG with 2 great events about women in horror. So thank you so much for everybody for coming out tonight, and thank you if you've been to our events before or if you've supported us in any way. We very much appreciate it, and you're very welcome, and we're glad to see you all here tonight. Shellie, Kate, anything that you want to add, SIG-wise?
Just that there'll be lots more in October. So you know, we're having a break over the summer, and we're already planning events. We've got a couple planned already for September, October, November. So, you know, look out for more information about that slightly later in the summer.
Yeah. And other exciting developments afoot as well, which we can't say too much about at the minute. But,
I'm up. Okay, cool. If people want to, you're welcome to use the chat function to talk, but you're also welcome to type any questions you have for anybody at any point. Alison's going to try and keep up with anything, and we'll see where we get. So without further ado, I'm going to start by handing over to Bruna Foletto, who is PhD student from Kingston University researching women horror filmmakers, and Bruna pulled this evening's event together. So we're going to let her introduce and then get going. And good luck, everybody. Have a good discussion.
Thank you, Laura. So I just wanted to say a few words before we kick off the event, but don't worry, I'm not gonna hijack it, so it's gonna be quite brief. I just wanna first of all thank Laura, Shellie, and Kate for saying yes to this event and for helping me along the way. This was my first event that I've ever organized, so I had a lot of questions and they were very nice with me. And I also want to thank everyone here today, including our panelists. We've got Alison, our lovely chair. Thank you very much for being here. And then we've got Shellie again, Martha, and Valeria. I do find that sometimes academics have an aura around them that makes it so hard for students like myself to approach them. But I realize that the horror community has been nothing but nice and welcoming, and for that I'm really truly appreciative. So thank you. And that's, with that out of the way, I just want to say a few things about the event. Not to be kissing anyone's butt with the book out there, but it was actually reading Women Make Horror that I got the idea for this event. I saw that a big chunk of the book was about female authorship, and all of the chapters that were dealing with that, they were approaching the subject through a different angle. And it was really eye-opening. And it was reading Alison's introduction and actually Martha's chapter that I got the idea for the second part of my thesis and for this event. Which is to talk about female authorship in the industry and to question why female filmmakers have been overshadowed throughout history. And just let me be clear, this is not to, you know, hate on the men, it's not to strip them from their credit. Of course not, that is never the what I want to do. But this is just an event to, you know, put women on the map, to talk about them and to correct history, which, paraphrasing Kaja Silverman, is a political necessity. I just wanted to say that is it. And now I'm handing over to Alison. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Bruna. That was lovely. That was really nice. And I've already written down one or two things you said that hopefully we might be able to pick up a bit more in the discussion. Hi everyone, I'm Alison. I am chairing this, so I'm not doing the talk, but I'm going to keep everybody in order tonight, hopefully. So we've got short kind of position papers from 4 scholars tonight. So we'll be hearing from Bruna about Deborah Hill. We're going to be hearing from Valeria about Michelle Garza. We're going to be hearing from Shellie about Mary Lambert. And I think that's 4, isn't it? Oh, well done. Good. Yeah, everyone's smiling at me. Yeah, well done, Ali. So we're going to have short papers, like 5 to 10 minutes. I mean, when academics say short and 5 to 10 minutes, it rarely actually ever is just 5 to 10 minutes, but I'm quite a tough chair, so we'll see how that goes. If you have any questions or comments that come up as you hear our panelists speaking, please do pop them in the chat, and I am going to try and keep an eye on it, as Laura said. And then the idea is we'll go out after these papers into a more general discussion, and hopefully I'll be able to bring in any questions that you might have as well. So we're going to start off with Martha. Martha wrote a beautiful chapter for Women Make Horror on Daria Nicolodi, who co-wrote Suspiria, and for other reasons to do with witches, I rewatched Suspiria today. So I think this kind of made me think Martha needed to go first, because I want to know what she's now got to say about Daria Nicolodi. So if I can hand over to Martha, thank you very much.
Thank you, Alison. And Bruna, thank you so much for putting this together. I've had a very long day and I'm excited to end it with this. As has been said, I wrote a chapter for Women Make Horror on Daria Nicolodi and her authorship of Suspiria. And what I wanted to start with really here as a jumping off point is thinking about things that were going on while I was writing that chapter and things that have happened since. So while I was writing it, which I think I was finishing it up in late, I don't know, a time is a mystery to me now, but essentially as I was writing it, the Suspiria remake came out. And so this was a very frustrating experience for the film itself, which I know has its fans, but also because of the way that it was being promoted and the way that the kind of discourse that surrounded it. So yeah, it was consistently promoted by its male director and screenwriter as, in the words of its director, great feminist film. And quite often, and especially by the screenwriter, as a feminist revision of the original film, which was very much presented as a bad object. And especially the screenplay especially is a bad object, with no recognition or discussion or acknowledgement of the authorship of that screenplay. Whereas the screenwriter is talking a lot about all this great research he did about into 70s feminism and this kind of stuff, annoying. And very often in reviews and in discussions around the film, it's referred to as a remake of Argento Suspiria. And so it's replicating this tendency that you see in this discussion of Suspiria in general, which is one of the things that I discuss in this chapter, of this like reflexive framing of it as Argento Suspiria, even when Nicolodi's screenplay work is acknowledged. And so it would be like, this is Argento Suspiria, but hey, fun fact, did you know that Daria Nicolodi co-wrote the screenplay? But that there's no kind of consideration of what the implications of that might be. So this is kind of what was going on while I was writing this chapter, which was an experience. And so then like the book comes out, it's amazing, award-winning, etc. Everyone loves it, brilliant. And then obviously like a few weeks after the book was published, with my chapter in it on Nicolodi's authorship, she then a few weeks later died. And in the kind of discussion around her death, there's a real shift, and there's a real effort to situate her as a screenwriter. And so just to kind of pull up one of the examples I found when I was having a little Google around earlier, the NME's headline on their story about her death refers to her as Suspiria's co-writer and Asia Argento's mother. But if you go back to their review of the Suspiria remake, there's no mention of her, and the original Suspiria is repeatedly referred to as Argento Suspiria, or like how it's revising Dario Argento, etc., etc. So, and there's a real like self-satisfaction quite a lot of the time that these kind of these news articles and obituaries take in the way that they're like, screenwriter Daria Nicolodi, look at me, look at that, I'm acknowledging her, aren't I wonderful? And a considerably more like care and attention that is taken in an obituary in acknowledging her as a creative worker than there would have been 2 days earlier. And so essentially, film culture wants women dead. And I think even further than that, there is a tendency for feminist film culture, you know, or kind of superficially or putatively feminist film culture to also want women dead, because then we can do the great work of rediscovering them. Like, look what we have done for her. And so this is kind of, this has made me feel really uneasy with a lot of the kind of metaphors that get used to discuss women's authorship, metaphors of recovery and rediscovery and unearthing. Because the thing with Daria Nicolodi is I didn't really have to do anything. I didn't have to find something. I didn't have to go to an archive. I didn't have to discover anything. It was all just there. She had been saying this all the time for decades. And so I didn't do any work in kind of, the primary thing that I was doing in that chapter was rereading the film. And so I think I have some kind of sort of like qualms, I suppose, with some of the ways that authorship sometimes gets discussed. There has been a great kind of deal of work in thinking about decentering the auteur, and in thinking about other kinds of models of authorship that are maybe collaborative authorship or multiple authorship. And there are kind of articles out there that literally are formulae for this. Be like, how much of a contribution do you have to make in our little formula to be considered an author or to be considered a mere collaborator? And it seems, this has always kind of bothered me as something that seems, you know, fairly antithetical to any kind of creative process. Firsthand, but also just, you know, it just becomes like, let's kind of divvy up a text. And what it doesn't do is transform how we understand the text itself. Because I think one of the things that's been really valuable to me in kind of reading a lot of feminist film history is in the emphasis that's placed on, you know, where we are in this and how the work that we're doing is determined by our desires and our relationship to a text, in where, you know, the actual kind of people who are creating it are always going to be something of a mystery. But if we kind of do kind of acknowledge them, how does that reshape our relationship to a film or a TV show or whatever? How do we redescribe the film so that women who exist, who live, who are still with us, can't just be reduced to fun facts and footnotes, but are necessary? So that's all I have.
Oh my God, Martha, that was so good. Can I take that as your pitch for your essay for Women Make Horror Too, please? Is that okay? So much, so much. Okay, so again, if you have any questions, do put them in the chat. I'm going to keep thinking about with that, and we'll go into the next kind of position paper that we've got. So we have another 3 speakers. We have Valeria, Shellie and Bruna. Do any of you have a particular preference for going next at all?
I can, if you want.
Oh, thank you, Shellie. Thank you.
Get it out of the way.
Go for it.
The rest of the papers. Okay, so I've got some slides, so bear with me a second. And my computer broke earlier. I'm too brain dead to do things off the cuff at the moment, so I will be reading from my phone, and for that I do apologise. So the person that I'm talking about is Mary Lambert. At the moment, I'm writing a monograph on Mary Lambert. And thinking about tonight and thinking about what I was going to talk about, I think something that I'm grappling with at the moment is, why did I pick Pet Sematary? Why did I pick Mary Lambert? One of the main reasons that I chose Pet Sematary in particular was because it's the only horror film that's ever really scared me. Like I assume a lot of you here, I started watching horror films way, way too young. And the fault here lies firmly at the feet of my older brother, who loved horror, and he'd let me come into the living room and sit there and watch all these VHS rental tapes with him. The first horror film that I remember watching is The Evil Dead, and I was about 5 or 6, and I quite happily sat through that, and a host of other horror films from that kind of era. But Pet Sematary, particularly this scene here, if it works, where a dying Victor Pascal gives Lewis Creed a foreboding warning about the Micmac burial ground, that scene there, that was just a bit too much for me, and I ran screaming out of the room, which is something that my older brother hasn't yet let me forget about. Pet Sematary made such an impact on me, though, that I grew up, even though I grew up to be a horror fan and a horror scholar, I always kind of avoided this film. I'd watched the sequel, Pet Sematary 2, love the sequel, but the original film was a bit of a no-go for me. I was just scared of it. Obviously, I'm here tonight talking about it. I got over it. But I still can't really think of this scene, and I'm going to strategically avert my eyes from it, for too long. Oh, I saw her, without freaking out. So pure abject fear. That was one of the first reasons that I wanted to focus on this film as an objective study. And I'm going to move quickly onto the next slide, because she does actually scare me. The second reason is that when I started to do research on the film, I realised that the majority of scholarship on Pet Sematary was concerned with Stephen King's source novel and not the film. Even in volumes dedicated to cinematic adaptations of Stephen King, Pet Sematary just always kind of felt like an afterthought. And I didn't really get this, because Pet Sematary was the top grossing horror film, I believe, of 1989. It's still in the top 100 grossing horror films of all time. And perhaps most importantly, it's still the top grossing horror film directed by a woman in cinematic history. And this brings me to the third reason I'm writing a book about Pet Sematary, which is Mary Lambert, the director of the film. If I had, when I started doing my research, felt that Pet Sematary was overlooked, then Mary Lambert is virtually non-existent in horror scholarship. And I mean, this is a woman who directed the film that really put the idea of Stephen King horror, cinematic horror, back on the map after a series of, and I know there's some people here tonight that will disagree with me, some pretty duff adaptations in the mid-80s. Mary Lambert's important, and not just in the study of women in horror, but in the study of horror more broadly. And I guess it didn't escape my attention when I started doing this research that no one had really done a long form project on her before, and the person doing it, me, is also a woman. So going back to that research, this is basically a breakdown of my book as it stands at the moment. I'm just making sure that I've not accidentally put something in the way of it. There you go. Yeah, this is basically a breakdown of my book as it stands at the moment. I'm not finished yet, so obviously this might change, but one of the chapters that I'm actually most excited about is that one there. In that chapter, I focus specifically on Mary Lambert and how she came to and works in the horror genre. And I should note that it's not my intention in this research to present Mary Lambert as this feminine filmmaker or to imbue her work with any kind of reverent womanliness. What I do argue, however, is that her gender did have an impact on her experiences directing Pet Sematary and in the reportage of the production, and that her status as a woman who's directed a Stephen King adaptation puts her in pretty scarce company, as so far there's only one other woman, Kimberly Peirse, that has done that. So George Romero was actually the person who was originally tipped as Pet Sematary's director when his production company, Laurel Entertainment, bought the rights for the film back in 1984. However, due to the rights changing hands to Paramount, and there was a Writers Guild of America strike in 1988, Pet Sematary, when it was at Paramount, needed to go into production very quickly, and George Romero wasn't available. And this news of the departure of Romero spread very quickly, particularly through Fangoria. And this is a quote from an issue in 1988 declaring, "The long-delayed movie version of Stephen King's Pet Sematary may finally go into production this year. Paramount Pictures acquired the option to distribute the King scripted film from Laurel. That's the good news. The bad news is that George Romero may not be directing. A Laurel source reports that Mary Lambert, who directed the poorly received Siesta, will helm." And this positioning, particularly within the pages of Fangoria, of Mary Lambert as George Romero's inexperienced and ill-suited foil, continued into reportage from the set during production. So issue 81 of Fangoria magazine in particular seems to fixate on this connection between Romero and Pet Sematary. The cover, I don't know if you can see, it's pretty blurry on the left-hand side, holds the tagline, King's Pet Sematary, where's Romero? And in the contents page, it makes it clear that Paramount's Pet Sematary is a Romero-less King adaptation. The on-set report compiled by Rodney A. Labe is even more direct in its comparison of Romero and Lambert, noting the decidedly paranoid atmosphere, his words, not mine, which is underlined by the fact that no amount of cajoling could get him an interview with Mary Lambert. Building on this, Labe writes that an insider on the set revealed to him that Mary wants to avoid controversy. George Romero was supposed to direct Pet Sematary, and some people still think he ought to be doing it. That was before he noted, quote unquote, Lambert's limited experience in directing films. And I guess an aspect of my research and of this particular part of the book is me kind of sticking my middle finger up at this kind of reportage on Mary Lambert on her behalf. And this kind of mistrust almost of Mary Lambert as a horror director carried on even after the film was a success. And it would seem that having a woman's name attached to a horror film does invite this close inspection of their credentials for directing horror. So even a decade and a half after the success of Pet Sematary, Stephen King was asked, did a woman director bring a different sensibility to the film than a man would have? And Stephen King, to his credit, said, the answer is a resounding no. It's as tough as it needs to be in the Mary Lambert version. Other than if it had been directed by the ghost of Sam Peckinpah, I can't imagine it being any harder or harder edged than it is now. And both King and Lambert have repeatedly over the years shown a great deal of respect for each other, with King in particular noting that he wanted to be Mary's advocate in directing Pet Sematary, and Mary Lambert stating that he was her ally during the production. And although this is the part of the book where I kind of have a sustained focus on Mary Lambert, her presence is there throughout the book. So in various chapters, I'm talking about her directorial style, the overarching themes of her work, her vision for her adaptation of Pet Sematary, her place as one of the kind of key female horror filmmakers of the 1980s, and her original intention for the sequel film, and that iteration that she never got to make. But the reason that I wanted to highlight this part of my research tonight in particular, and the reason I'm excited about it and my broader Pet Sematary research, is because first of all, it led to the opportunity to participate tonight with these lovely people. And because also I hope it's going to be part of this distinct movement that's going on in horror scholarship that's kind of been sparked by things like Alison's book, Women Make Horror, that we're all involved in, which is kind of uncovering these forgotten, hidden or overlooked histories of the horror genre. And that's all I got.
Thank you so much, Shellie. That was great. And in the chat, someone, Kelly Holmes, is letting us know that Mary Lambert's very approachable. So I think, like, as a fellow Pet Sematary fan, I think we're going to be taking up Kelly's offer to get us in touch with Mary Lambert, because that is amazing. Right, I've got loads of notes on that, thank you. What we'll do though is we'll go straight on to the next one. So we've still got 2 papers left. We've got one from Bruna and one from Valeria. Do you have a preference on who goes next?
Can I go?
Yes, go for it.
Okay, so I'll also be sharing my screen. I'll just assume everyone can see that. If you can't, just let me know. Okay, so I'll be talking about Deborah Hill, which I have to say wasn't something that I had on my mind for ages. It was actually one of my supervisors, Simon Brown, that might be here tonight, I don't know, that opened my eyes to Deborah Hill. And that is not to say that I hadn't heard about her before. I mean, Halloween is my favorite film, so of course I had. But it wasn't until I started doing some research about her that I realized how important she was and is. Her impact on the industry is enough of a reason to talk about her, but another reason that I want to talk about her tonight is because there is not a lot about her out there. If you look on Google, you will find some articles, mainly obituaries, unfortunately. And then I found 2 books. The first one, Women Who Run the Show by Molly Gregory, which is a book about women in the industry in the 70s to the 90s. And then we've got, of course, Alexandra Heller-Nicholas' 1,000 Women in Horror, which of course talks a little bit about Deborah Hill. And then there's the book, a biography by Brian McFadden about Deborah Hill, but it's not an academic book. So, okay, so to quote Alexandra Heller-Nicholas, Deborah Hill is one of the most important women behind the scenes of US horror in the 70s and 80s. Not only was she responsible for cult classics like Halloween, The Fog, Escape from New York, The Dead Zone, and the 90s version of the Attack of the 50-Foot Woman, but her name also transcends horror, and she becomes an important figure in the whole industry, having mentored people like James Cameron, for example. But also, she was an avid speaker about women in the industry, which led her to win a Crystal Award in 2003 for her role as a mentor to many young women. So what I'm really interested in doing is looking back at her cult classics and lifting Carpenter's auteur name from the films and pinpointing where specifically her name can be found. So I have here Deborah Hill from Haddonfield, New Jersey to Disney, because Haddonfield being the place she grew up in, and then Disney just shows how broad her work was. So she worked, like I mentioned, in cult classics, but she went on to work in Oscar-winning films, comedy, dramas, and even to Disney. What I think it's one of the most important things about her is how much she understood the industry and how much passion she had about making films. In many interviews, she said that she only got her first job by faking her way into a film set, which was during Goodbye Norma Jean in 1976. She said that she had worked previously, which she hadn't, and then she landed on her role as a script supervisor, which then the same year she got a job working on the film Assault on Precinct 13, which is a film directed by John Carpenter. She was a script supervisor. She also worked on the editing, and then she did work with actors as well, which just goes to show how much she made herself useful on the set. When she became an established producer, people who had previously worked with her mentioned her ability to make things happen, especially when the production had no money. So you will read stories about her painting leaves brown and then scattering them around the street to make it seem like it was autumn during the filming of Halloween, and then fetching all of those leaves again to reuse them in another scene. We read stories about her lying to the police, saying that she had a permit to shoot, which she actually didn't. So just stories like that really show how resourceful she was. But what I really want to talk about today is the film Halloween, which everyone knows. So it is well known that she co-wrote and she produced the film. But to what extent her impact on the film, to what extent people know about her impact on the film, it's not that broad. So there is the first picture that we see in there. It is the first shot of the film when actually the hand that is supposed to be Michael Myers killing his sister is actually her hand. But her impact on the film goes way beyond that. As I mentioned, she grew up in a town called Haddonfield, and which is the same name of the town in Halloween, Haddonfield, Illinois, which is a fictional town. So she actually had the idea of having Michael Myers killing everyone in this very small town. So then the contrast between those would heighten the terror and fear in the film. But also as a co-writer, both herself and John Carpenter divided the screenplay in two, basically. John Carpenter would then write everything about Michael Myers, And then Deborah Hill was in charge of writing things about the teenage girls. So she actually wrote all of the dialogue between Linda, Laurie, and Annie. She created the character of Laurie Strode. Many people say that the three girls were actually three different versions of Deborah. And here I just have a little piece of dialogue that, if you indulge me, I'll read it because I think it's a fine piece of dialogue. So it is Linda, Laurie, and Annie. And Linda is talking about Annie. She's saying, the only reason she babysits is to have a place for. Then Laurie interrupts by saying, oh shit. And then Annie says, I have a place for that. So I think that this just shows how brilliant Deborah Hill was, this piece of dialogue. And then the last thing I want to mention, like I said before, she created the character of Laurie Strode. So, like I said, she wrote the character, but not only that, she championed for Jamie Lee Curtis to be cast on the role, which John Carpenter didn't want. She actually knew that she was the daughter of, what's her name? The woman who plays Marion in Psycho. What's her name? I don't remember. But she's the daughter of that woman. And I think someone put on the chat now. I don't know, I cannot see. Anyway, so she thought that by casting Jamie Lee Curtis, they would be having their own cult following. I don't know if that actually happened, but that was a quite interesting idea that she had. So I like to think that by creating Laurie Strode, Deborah Hill changed horror in three ways. First of all, academically speaking, she created the final girl, which we, till this day, talk about the character of the final girl. In the horror genre, she created Laurie Strode, which is a character that many films would then try to copy. And then on a much smaller scale, she was an important piece of the puzzle to giving the role to Jamie Lee Curtis, which then changed her career, because then she would go on to be cast in films such as Prom Night, The Terror Train, and many films like that, and being recognized as the Scream Queen. So I think that it is important to look back at films and doing exactly that, not just saying like Martha said, oh, fun fact, Halloween was co-written by a woman, but also finding out what that means. And this is what I try to do with Deborah Hill. That is it from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bruna. I also love the reference to Terror Train, which I saw for the first time a few weeks ago and found to be an absolute joy. So it was very nice to hear Terror Train mentioned as well. Okay, I'm going to move swiftly on because I want to make sure we've got plenty of time for discussion. And thank you to everyone in the chat as well. To Jason Braun, I didn't actually know that Gail Ann Hurd wrote Sarah Connor's lines in The Terminator, but this is very pleasing. So thank you for that. Okay, right. So last but definitely not least is the wonderful Valeria, who is going to be talking about Michel Gaza. So take it away, please, Valeria.
Awesome. So I'm going to also share my screen. Let's see. So hopefully all is well. No, no, it was not well. There we are. Cool. So I think that shows. Yeah. So I hope that everything is all right and that you can see it okay, perfectly. So thank you so much. I mean, it's sort of like, it's very interesting to just present this bit right after all these amazing contributions to the dialogue, because I've chosen to do something a little bit different. And I think it speaks a great deal to this idea of how female authorship is also being championed. I mean, slowly but steadily in certain contexts. So today I'm going to talk about I believe it. I mean, this is not me trying to be I don't know, hyperbolic, but I do believe that she is a big part of Mexico's future in terms of genre filmmaking, the work of Michel Garza. So this filmmaker, she is now developing her first feature film, of which I will talk a little bit in just a second. So to me, it was very interesting to find out we have some friends in common, and finding out her work made me really realize that I wanted to write about it. And even though it's not necessarily a part of the dissertation work that I have been doing, it has really piqued my curiosity in many ways. Michelle Garza, she is a young director and former vocalist, former singer for the punk band Especie Fallida. She was also the guitar player of Secreto Público. So interestingly, to me, it was first very interesting to realize that there is a connection between this punk ethics of representation in her filmmaking, something that interestingly enough, I didn't really know about the connection a little bit, and I found out after I discovered her work, and I got really immersed in her short films. I found this to be really interesting and provocative because of the very politics of not only DIY, because she was part of a generation graduated from the Centro de Capacitación Cinematográfica, like one of the biggest film schools in Mexico City, but also because of the resourcefulness that this brings with it. But attached to that, this notion that I keep stumbling upon in her work that is really refreshing, honestly, about championing dissident visions and representations about sexuality, about the containment of the body, and about interventions done to it. And by this, I mean medical interventions. One of the things that I find the most fascinating about her gaze, and I'm going to get a little bit over to that. So because of this particular turn of events, I believe it to be quite interesting and provocative that her first feature, Huesera, which is in filming right now and it's being in development, it's one of the very few genre works championed to receive fiscal stimulus and state support, which is fairly untraditional. So to me, one of the things that I'm very interested in and that I have been working around with my work in my PhD in general and my research is the way in which different filmmakers also attach themselves or try or dispute notions of nationality. And I believe that her work does that in a very intimate way, specifically talking to very small environments where this is enacted and these relations are played out in romantic relationships or in family relationships. And a good example of this, and I mentioned this because specifically this iteration or reiteration and renegotiation of what it means to be a gendered body inserted in the Mexican context speaks a great deal about, speaks a great deal to cinema as one of these primary devices to circulate and negotiate the notion of Mexicanness historically. So this reformulation to me seems very provocative. A good example of this is Clara's Rage. This is one of her short films from a few years back that looks at this particular experience of Clara, the protagonist, in a part of rural Mexico, and how this sort of containment and isolation of Clara speaks to not only the repression and sort of like policing of her sexuality, but also in finding herself attached to nature in rural Mexico, which I found very provocative and interesting. I have chosen this frame because I believe it to be quite indicative. I mean, I couldn't get quite the frame. She is touching like a huge grasshopper that just manages to get outside of the cabin where she is being kept. Well, I would say captive, even though it's supposed to be in this frame where her family is worried about her going out. Something about this containment of sexuality to me is very provocative. She is kept in isolation by her husband and her mother in this short film, which explores this contention in the domestic space and the policing of female sexuality and corporeality in this particular context of rural Mexico. And this is done in a very interesting way. I invite you to take a peek. All these works that I'm going to mention, except for one, One is in development. The other one, I believe, is only available on DVD, but I recommend that you take a look at this. Another way in which this reformulation happens, and this was another facet about these negotiations of identity and the experience of the gendered body in a Mexican context, is her contribution to Mexico Bárbaro, Barbarous Mexico, which had a previous volume, with Gigi Saúl being one of the directors sort of reformulating this. So there was a second installment, Mexico Bárbaro 2, in which she contributed with a segment called Vitriol. So to me, it's very interesting that this configuration of Mexicanness in its brutality speaks to violence inflicted upon women. So this is, very shortly, not to spoil it, a short film about a woman that, well, she is abused by this man who she trusts, and she decides to do something very radical by, well, pretty much mutilating herself or bathing herself in acid in this sort of effort to commit this sort of revenge on her own terms, which to me was very interesting and sort of coincidental with Mariano Enrique's Things That We Lost in the Fire, because there is one of these short stories by the Argentinian writer speaks to this, about how ugliness is reformulated and sort of reclaimed as a wound of war, if you will. And to me, it was interesting that that's the facet of Mexico that she portrays. One of these, I mean, a country that is lead in feminicida violence, or feminicidal violence, and in feminicidio, and leads the statistics in Latin America. So to speak of that is also to speak another facet of Mexicanness. And to me, that was quite provocative. However, she has also done some other very interesting, I mean, her frame story was very beautiful. And she has also done some other recuperations that, to me, sort of like, they caught my eye first thing when I discovered her work. This intimate look and medical gaze upon her subjects, which is here exemplified in the original. This is a short film that she actually made. I believe it was made in the UK. It's sort of like in a cooperation. And this experience of the female body is intervened, or sort of, I mean, I'm not going to spoil it for you because that's also available online. But the idea of the double or the copy, and how is it that these bodies are also sort of manipulated by a medical process, and how they undergo processes of loss and grief. In this case of this couple, one of which has a terrible, a terrible seizure at some point, and sees herself quite ill. So what is the price to exact for that intimacy at the hands of a medical establishment that sort of does this really dubious experiment on her? And to me, these experiences of loss and intimacy are quite provocative, in the sense that they're very connected to this idea of exteriority, of a medical establishment having a hand in that, and sort of thwarting that intimacy. Needless to say, it's really beautifully made. But onto one of the things that I believe are also very interesting about this turning tide, and this is her most recent work, Huesera. Huesera is a film that has been in development for a couple of years now. It was picked up by Blood Window, which is a sidebar by Ventana Sur, to develop genre films and give them a good springboard for their circulation, pitching, distribution, etc., materials that are done in Latin America. And it was co-written with Avia Castillo, so they are a female couple and authorship in this. And these short films that I have mentioned alongside other of her works are also written by her. So there is this sort of very, like a very interesting situation there with writing and directing the works. And this feature that was picked up and developed by Michelle and is right now in the process of filming, as I was saying, received fiscal stimulus. And as in Mexico, there is a provision in the law that started in 2007 to grant private investors the possibility of deducting tax if one collaborates with a certain amount to production or distribution of features. needless to say, this is not something that is routinely granted to genre films. There are relatively few that are financed by this particular sort of provision in fiscal law, but they also can take a very long time to develop. But this particular program, I had timed myself, but I'm almost there, I promise. So this particular program, from 2007 to 2020, out of 743 listed projects, out of all of these titles, only 40 features are genre films. Like out of 743. So for me, like the penny to drop was like, first, it is of course very underrepresented. But on the other hand, doing this and collating a lot of numbers through this period, only 3 of those 40 genre features in that span, 2007-2020, only 3 were directed by women. Los Ojos Azules by Eva Arigis in 2012, Vuelven, or Tigers Are Not Afraid by Isa Lopez in 2017, and Huesera by Michelle Garza. So to me, this is something that also rings quite true with the fact that there is definitely a turning tide, and yet there is, of course, a massive underrepresentation of not only female filmmakers, but also non-binary filmmakers, of which it is incredibly difficult to find any material when it pertains to Latin America. So as having said that, I believe that Huesera, which by the way, just by way of synopsis, deals with the experience of my namesake, Valeria, that's the name of the protagonist, who after trying to have a child for a long time and finding out that she's actually pregnant, starts being assailed by this entity called the Huesera. Like, I don't know how to, I don't think that it has an accurate translation, but this sort of like female ghost or entity that is assailing her. So this very, very specific incarnate sort of process of pregnancy is relayed through the lens of Mitchell, and in the script that she wrote with Avia Castillo, and it looks amazingly promising. But I believe that is also speaking a great deal to the need to open up experiences not only of the national, but also how it pertains to the gendered body in contemporary Mexico, which sheds a very different light in a span of several decades of how this has been relayed and placed upon gendered bodies, the destiny of nation, and how this sort of is bursting at the seams. So I'm just going to leave it there with this really beautiful frame. I hope I didn't overstep my time a ton, but that's all from on my part.
Thank you so much, Valeria. That was wonderful. Oh, you're all awesome. I love doing these. I love them even better when I'm not speaking and I can just listen to what everybody's saying. That makes it so much better, and I can just sit and think about it. This is great. We're doing good for time. We've got about 40 minutes for just chat. We've got a couple of questions already that I certainly want to ask. We've got a few comments from the chat, but I think we might initially, I thought, do any of the speakers have any comments or questions on each other's first? Is there anyone who wants to jump in? Nobody yet. Everyone's been very courteous. Everyone's been very, very polite. Okay, well, I'm going to open. I've got a couple of questions for each of the speakers, but I'm actually going to start with Valeria first, because it's the shortest question, actually. So you're very lucky. So the other papers were all dealing with people who were working on feature films. And I know you talked about Huesera, and that's going to be a feature, but the rest of yours were short film examples. So I wondered if you could just talk about why studying short film is important for understanding the work of women filmmakers.
Yes, I think I think that's a great sort of leeway into the ways in which this has helped greatly, like especially the parallel that I find is that Argentinian horror filmmaking has a great deal of that. but historically, at least sort of drawing a comparison, it has helped a great deal to develop ideas and ideas and narratives for feature films. But at the same time, I believe that there's something so incredibly significant about the format, because not only is it that historically women have sort of taken to short films because of the lack of economic opportunities that there is about financing a feature, as evidenced by those like abysmal numbers from Efficine. But I also believe that there is, specifically when it pertains to the case of Michel, something that I have been finding quite interesting is the fact that these short films are also very connected, I find, to this sort of like punk approach to filmmaking, which to me is a very interesting crossroads in her work, specifically considering that she is part of a generation that has already been professionalized sort of in this sort of environment, in this choosing of this choice of having it interlock with the politics of punk filmmaking and music in representation, to me is very provocative. And I think that, I mean, aside from the fact that short films really lend themselves for her to shine in those things, but I think that financially, at least to me, or like the way that I have been finding out throughout my research, speaks a great deal for the lack of opportunities to develop features. So it lends itself to a great way to, I think, approach female authorship in the way that circumstances have not only shaped it, they have managed to sort of flip the idea that a short film is lesser somehow. So I don't know if that answers the question, or if I'm rambling.
Not at all, not at all. That was perfect, thank you. I do have more questions that I want, and I can pick up some very useful comments that are in the chat. But at this point, I'd also like to open it out to our audience in general. So if any of you do have a question, I don't know how you do it on the Zoom. I'm not great at this. I assume, like, can you raise your hand or something? We have a hand raised. And I believe Laura, who is our resident technical whiz, will be able to let you in. So I think, Kelly, can we go to Kelly? Laura, can you do this for me? I can't do this.
Hi everyone.
Yes. Hello.
I will lower my hands. Hi everybody. I wasn't expecting to put my camera on today, so I do apologise. I really don't know how I ended up in this room today. I think I probably saw you guys on Twitter or something, and a reminder came out today, so I'm really glad that it did. I'm a former academic. I was senior lecturer, and I used to teach horror studies at University of Derby for like, oh god, a really long time. But now I'm a film director and writer, and I am in development at the moment making a menopausal body horror. So I feel like that is relevant to this room.
I don't know what you're saying.
I just feel like it's relevant. We're all going to go through it at some point. I haven't been through it yet, but like we're all going to go through it at some point. I just wanted to sort of like pick up on a couple of things. Valeria, first of all, I love the fact that you're looking at short films. I, to this point, have only made short films for like TV channels and things like that, and I'm in development on my first feature at the moment. The fact that you are looking at a woman's authorial voice attached to short films, I think is astounding. And if you ever want to talk about that, please reach out to me, and I'm really want to talk about that. But I also wanted to say to Shellie, I don't know Mary personally myself. I do have her email address, funnily enough. I was meant to email her for some reason or another at some point in time. All I wanted to say is she teaches in New York. I met one of her former students at a film festival, and apparently she's very approachable. People with blue ticks on their Twitter don't always get their messages and things like that. If you want to reach out to me personally, I'll stick my email and my website and stuff in the chat for you. Then I can put you in touch with someone who knows her.
That'd be amazing. Thank you so much.
I don't know her personally myself, but what I've heard is she's very approachable, and I think she'd be truly honoured that someone's writing a book about her. So I think she'd want to know before you
Oh.
actually put it out there in the world. But the fact that you're doing it, I think, is wonderful. And also, whoever's writing about Deborah Hill, go on, girl, that's bloody amazing. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kelly. That's fantastic. Thank you. Do we have anyone else from the audience who would like to raise their hands and ask any questions? And if you want to be on camera, you can be. And if you don't want to be on camera and you just want to talk, you can as well. Like, I knew I had to come on camera. That's why I've done my hair. So. Okay, for now, what I want to do is kind of open a question like to all of you. It's one of them kind of typical questions you get in academic discussions where someone goes, I've got a question, and then they talk endlessly about their own work for 15 minutes before they get to the question. So I kind of want to do that, but there's a point to it. And if each of you or some of you could answer, that would be great. So when I wanted to make Women Make Horror, what I really struggled with to start with was like, how do you research women working in horror? Like, how do you do it? And I've thought a bit more about that with putting the book together and getting it out into the world and having all the wonderful essays that are in it. And what was really important to me was lots of different ways to do the work. So there's not like one set of theories or one set of methods or anything. And, you know, I still feel like that book's like the tip of the iceberg, like the tiniest tip for just starting to do this work. Like, we could have made like 12 volumes of that book just to get going. So getting beyond the academic preamble, I've been thinking a lot about like women's film history, and what I'm really interested in obviously is horror. And for me, I feel like doing this kind of work goes through several stages, and I wanted to ask you what your stages were and kind of how you do it. So for me, it begins with often finding the women. So I like finding obscure films that nobody knows about. That's kind of taken as standard as a film academic, like that appears to be part of the job, being that kind of geek. But what I'm actually often more interested in is films that people might have heard of, but have women working on them in roles that until this point haven't really been discussed. So Daria Nicolodi is a prime example. So for me, it's often finding the women working on the horror films. And then the next stage for me would be like investigating them generally. Like, so the kind of stuff Bruna was talking about as well, like who are they? Where did they come from? What have they worked on? And then this is where it gets hard, which is like, how do you then analyze their work? Like, so you found this woman who makes horror, like, and you found out shit about her, you found out what she did, where she came from, you found out what she worked on, maybe you found she was uncredited on something and now you found proof that she did it, whatever. But if you actually want to think and write about her, like, what is your approach? Like, how do you do it? And I feel like for me at the moment, me personally, like, this is the hard question. And this is the important question, which is, how do we do this work? And then going back to like Martha's brilliant opener, it's how do we reinscribe the women without being, hey, fun fact, did you know a woman edited Chopping Mall? You know, like, how do you do something like meaningful with this? So I wanted to know, because I think that's quite a hard question. You might not have the answer, but I wondered if these are the kinds of questions that you've been grappling with, or what kind of stages you lot go through with it. So that's to all of and any. Bruna.
Yes. Wow, I do not have the answer. What I wanted to say is that a few years ago, so I did my MA in 2016. And that I did my dissertation on women filmmakers, women directors of horror. And I remember then, 2016, just Googling women directors of horror, and then I would find 10, and that was it. And then I remember going to a bunch of articles and just finding, like Google, not really even deep academic research, just on Google, finding, you know, because it was 2016, so it was just after the Babadook honeymoon, a girl walks
Home Alone at Night.
Yeah, thank you. So it was starting to happen, but then I couldn't find that many women or that many films. That's not to say that they weren't making any films, I just couldn't find them. And now that I'm picking up on my dissertation, now that I'm doing my PhD, I'm doing the same research. I'm like, women, horror, and films. And it's so much easier to find information, and not only that women are now making more films, but I find that I have more access to older films. And this has been really nice, because when I was doing my MA, I had a list of, 50 films. Now I have a list of 350 films. And that goes to not just women who speak English, but other languages as well, because I'm Brazilian. So I try to bring some of that as well. And short films, so not only features. But yeah, so as I mentioned, I'm now starting to move away from textual analysis. So I'm really struggling with that question that you've made. So I do not have the answer to. I would like to know if anyone has, so I can, yeah, that's about it.
It's a super hard question. It's a ridiculous question, Bruna. So thank you for going first in answering it as well. Anyone else about how they're trying to do this work? Like, what do you do? How do you do it?
Yeah, I can sort of go on. I mean, I think one of the reasons why, I don't know, I kind of ended up writing the chapter that I did and saying the things I was saying earlier is I do think it is really, really hard. And because, I mean, for me, it feels like there's always a kind of a gap somewhere that you can't ever fill, and of like how the labor gets to the text. And you know, because it seems like it's actually with like, oh, you know, an artwork, basically, like, you know, it's, you actually kind of like can't make those things match up equally in some kind of neat little scientific way. And that's where the problem is. And I think maybe the answer is just like that being the thing, that actually trying to kind of like reconcile those things and make something kind of neat and explanatory is never going to work, really. And to just sort of find a way to be okay with that. I mean, I don't know. So I'm also like co-editing a book on women in 70s Hollywood, or like in and around women in kind of 70s American film. And we've been kind of thinking about these very same questions, and we have these very kind of loose sections of like history and historiography and kind of texts, which are much more kind of close readings of films, and then theory and criticism, and sort of rethinking theories of authorship, but also like 70s film theory in light of the work of various women. And, you know, our contributors have come at it from a number of different angles, but it's like kind of, I think with any edited collection, it's always just like throwing a load of darts at a board and like seeing where they land and seeing whether something comes out of it, because it's a big problem that you like. I don't think there is one good answer for that, and it so radically depends on the kind of film, the kind of filmmaking that you're talking about. But it is like a really big and really important question. There's not really an answer, but
No, it totally is. And Anna Bogutskaya in the chat just said also, I think it's around a problem around archiving, and then how can like we build on the work that women are doing now about women working in horror, such as Anna and such as, you know, us lot here and other people that are doing marvelous work out in the world, and how can we kind of like collate that and bring that together, so when the next generation post Bruna comes to their masters and wants to write about women filmmakers, how do they find that body of work? And that idea of archives, because, you know, you said there's a gap you can't ever fill between the labor of making the film and then the finished text. Because I used to do a lot of archival work. I used to really love going to like the BFI special collections and getting my hands on like the draft screenplays and the memo documents and just looking at the tangible materials that you've got. But a lot of the films that I work on now aren't necessarily old enough to be in the BFI, or they're not necessarily like big enough in terms of kind of commercial features to have files there. So I'm often dealing with more recent, very low budget, no budget cinema, and there is no archive for that. It's not that the archive is invisible, like unless you know the filmmaker, it feels almost non-existent.
Yeah, and it's also, I mean, even when, I mean, for my first book, I did the big like archival trip to California or whatever, and then, you know, the archive never really kind of gives you what you want from it. You know, there's always a lack there, I feel like, even when you have something that's like there's actually very good files for.
That's great. You went a bit then on my connection, but it keeps telling me that my internet's connection dodgy. So I don't know if it's you or me. So, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back and kind of take this discussion out as well to the rest of the panel, picking up what we've been chatting about, picking up what's coming up in the chat. Have we got any other comments or thoughts or feelings about this?
If I may, I don't know.
Yep, go for it, Valeria, and then we'll go to Aaron.
Because I just sort of want to hop on what Ali and Martha have just said, like what you guys were saying about archival work and sort of like this, yeah, like how recent works often pose that sort of challenge, and it sort of got me thinking about some sort of living archive, if you will. And I keep thinking, I find out, like, because Michelle, for example, like the work that I was discussing, I found because of a network of friends and colleagues and filmmakers and people that are women doing horror in Latin America. So we're sort of like keeping this thread alive, and I find that it's so important, like the tight knit that there is also among a community, not only of fans or critics, but rather of women building upon the work of other women, is a crucial and fundamental sort of stepping stone towards this, to specifically sort of avoid that sort of starting anew that Anna was saying in the chat, because it's such an interesting sort of thing where there is like this sense of novelty. But I mean, women have been making horror for a very long time, as Ali says in the introduction of the book. So I find it really interesting also that these sorts of cooperations were enabled, even though it was very frustrating at the beginning because of the restrictions of COVID. This is where a lot of these springboards started. So whereas we didn't have maybe a lot of forums, specifically I'm talking about Latin America because it's my area of focus, where they didn't start. They then started blooming because of this cooperation among women. So we have like many also sidebars within the festivals, but communities that are keeping this alive in more informal forums. So I think that maybe that's, I mean, of course that seems like super like a big statement to say. I'm not saying that this is going to probably replace other practices, but of course that it adds that sort of living archive in the making sort of thing.
Yeah, completely. Thank you, Valeria. Thank you. Okay, could we let Aaron in then, please?
Hiya.
Hello.
Have I appeared okay?
Yep.
Is like this sound working? Thank you. Listen, thank you very much, everyone. That was incredible. I've got loads of things written for everyone, but I've just got two very quick questions. Sort of questions. One for Martha and one for Shellie, if that's all right. With Martha's paper, I was thinking, I was wondering what she thought on the extent to which the producers of the remakes are announcing, or were announcing, their Suspiria as very much a sort of intellectual exercise, kind of required to do as most people do and focus on the more visceral elements of the original film, I suppose. So in foregrounding the set pieces and the effect of the soundtrack and so on and so forth. On the realization of the ideas in the screenplay, you can kind of pretend like the screenplay never existed, which also allows. Essentially, I'm wondering if there was a bit of sort of genre snobbery going on in what they were saying that would be complicated if they even acknowledged the fact that the film had a script at all. Never mind one that was largely written by a woman. And the other question was for Shellie. Just It's just I love that you're writing a book about Pet Cemetery, and I'm really looking forward to it. I just wondered your opinion on a line that has I've never known how to read a line, and since you're here, I'd love to know what you think. This is a bit of a spoiler for the film, but I mean, Mary Lambert's very mischievous the whole way through Pet Sematary, as you know. And I love that she was doing this around the same time she was doing Like a Prayer for Madonna. Given how sarcastic it is at times, and the kind of the gallows humor, you know, the Ramones track, "The Kids Are Ready to Go" just before Kate steps onto the road. I've always been wondering that when the wife returns and you hear on the screen or on the soundtrack the line from earlier in the film, "What you own always comes back to you." And obviously Stephen King wrote the thing, but there's something really off about that line arriving at that moment, and I've never really been sure how to read it, given how kind of sarcastic and blackly funny the rest of it is. And I just wondered how you read it. How do you interpret that line?
Do you want to go first, Martha?
Sure. Thanks for the question, Aaron. Lovely to see you. Yeah, I think there is something to that. I think there's definitely a way in which it's that film is, you know, one of the things that it's trying to do is like drain the prettiness from the original and to make it something much kind of harder and more intellectual. I do think that's part of it. But one of the things I think is interesting about it, I don't think it quite works because I don't think they really know what they're doing with it. But the thing that is interesting about the remake is the way that it is basically flipping the original film inside out. And so that everything it's doing, all those intellectualizing gestures are kind of the negative of the original film. And a lot of the things that it sort of draws out of the text, like all the kind of Holocaust stuff, is submerged in the original film. Like I had a whole section that I cut out of my chapter on this because it was not relevant at all. But you know, one of the things that actually Nickelodeon talks about in interviews, or talked about, was that you know, her father, I think, was Jewish, and the set designer on Suspiria was Jewish, and she was like, we kind of bonded over this, and like there's Hebrew text in the film. And, you know, there's, you know, it's shot in Munich. There's all these kind of allusions to Nazis. I mean, there's stuff going on in there that the remake then kind of like draws on and sort of turns inside out and kind of draws to the surface or kind of like switches around. So it actually, a lot of what it's doing depends on the screenplay of the original film, which is completely contrary to how they were representing it in the press. Like that screenwriter's giving interviews where he's like, yeah, I'd never seen it before. Luca just like asked me to do it, and I was like, what is this? Watched it once and then never went back to it. And I was like, that's obviously nonsense. Like if you actually watch this film, it doesn't even make any sense. But there's this way in which, yeah, they're trying to kind of build it up as like, we are the great kind of feminist intellectuals, and we have this silly little Italian genre film, and like we are doing these great things with it. And it's even in a way that doesn't actually make sense for the film.
Thank you. Yeah. That's excellent answer, Mark. Thank you, and it's good to see you again as well.
I think with the line in Pet Sematary when he says "what you own comes back to you," I think there's kind of like two strands to it. So when Stephen King wrote the book published it in 1983, there was a lot of land claims going on in Maine. For tribes claiming back their ancestral lands. And I think a lot of that kind of filtered into the book. So there's a lot of lines in the book about how far back does the property line go, kind of further than you'd ever want to sort of venture and things like that. And then I think maybe more of Mary Lambert's influence is there's a strand of ownership in Pet Sematary that's sort of intrinsically connected to Lewis's masculinity. And his kind of ownership of the family, and his want and need to protect that family. And, you know, kind of when Church dies, you know, does he resurrect Church because of, a lot of people compare Pet Sematary to Frankenstein, which I don't really agree with, because I think the two characters are coming from different places. Like Dr. Frankenstein is trying to push that barrier between life and death, and Lewis, it's more kind of grief and the crazy things that grief makes you do. And I think when he resurrects Church, I mean, first of all, you know, when he resurrects Church, he doesn't even know it's going to work the first time he resurrects something. And he does it, like, to the way I read it, is he does it to protect Ellie, and so she doesn't go through grief. He doesn't think she's old enough or ready to go through grief. And plus, he doesn't really want to deal with the fallout from Rachel and her kind of aversion to death. And I think as you get kind of towards the end of the film, it's kind of Lewis's, I mean, he's not the greatest dad, but he's a lot better than some Stephen King dads, but he's kind of, it's his just falling into this chaos of trying to protect this family unit and trying to keep it together no matter what form that takes. So I think there is something tied up in there, you know, not just with the tribal lands claims that were going on at the time that the book was written, and also still ongoing when the film was released, but it is kind of tied up with Lewis's masculinity as well, I think. I hope that answers your question. I think I rambled, but
No, excellent. Thank you. Thank you to both of you. Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Is there anyone else who would like to ask a question at this point? Again, I've got some others I can pick up, but just in case everyone's tired of my face.
I can't raise my hand because I'm hosting.
Oh, hello.
Hello. Then I think the discussion took a more interesting turn, so it kind of got lost a bit. Anybody, I don't mind who wants to pick this one up. And I think, you know, a couple of you have already touched upon this, especially Martha and Bruna, given their case studies. But I'm just wondering to what extent people's creative work, women's creative work specifically in horror, gets kind of overlooked as a result of them not being directors. So in you know, we tend to kind of still centralize directors in studies of films. Authorship is still reigns, even you know, even with all that interesting theoretical work that is taking place, kind of decentralizing the author, the director as author. So I'm wondering how, you know, how, to what extent women's work in horror kind of being sidelined or overlooked is due to so much of that work taking place outside of directorship and in other creative roles. I don't mind who wants to tackle it.
I know. Do you want to go, Bruna? You go in. Go for it.
Yeah. So I think that's very interesting. I think that it kind of becomes like a pyramid, like everyone just goes for the director and everyone thinks about the male director. And I guess when you're trying to put the woman director there, she falls to the bottom of the food chain. And if you're not the director, if you're the writer, producer, then you're even further on the bottom. So I guess that makes it for people to go unnoticed. And like we were saying before about short films, I think that's another aspect that people don't actually pay much attention to, because if you're not writing, if you're not directing, if you're not a male directing a feature, some people will not pay attention. So if you're, for example, a producer, a female producer of a short film, then I think people will not even look at you. So I think it's just about all of those things, just sum. It is a sum of all of those things that ended up helping for people to go unnoticed, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
I was just going to add something as well. I don't have any like clever answers, but the whole thing of like in film studies, the great author is the director, the Billy Big Bollocks at the top of the tree, always a bloke, you know. And it's not just in academia, all the movie magazines and everything with the rise of like authorship and the director as the one in charge, all of that from the 70s onwards, whatever. And what I really found, like doing Women Make Horror, but writing the book that I'm trying to write now, is that directors are fine. And I'm talking about some women identifying directors, but I'm more interested in the woman who's the production designer on My Bloody Valentine. I'm more interested in the editor on Tower of Terror from the 1940s. I'm more interested in the cinematographer of The People Under the Stairs rather than the fact that it's directed by Wes Craven. And so it's slightly me going, fuck you, to the primacy of the director. Because I think what Laura's hinting at is absolutely the case. With the director at the top of the power pyramid, everybody looks there first, but we all know it's collaborative. And we all know, like, films aren't made by one person. We've established that. So let's actually work on the ways that we analyze screenwriters, such as Martha does so beautifully. Let's think about the way that we analyze editors and cinematographers and everybody else, so we can actually give fair shots rather than attributing everything to the director's vision. And I think Kate's put her hand up too.
So yeah, just sort of following on from what you were saying in a way, Ali, because you mentioned their kind of film journals and so on in the 70s and the way in which they emphasised authorship. And I was just quite interested in the fact that both Shellie and Martha focused on kind of journalistic framings of, you know, female contributions. So Martha, you were talking about the way in which Nickelodeon was only kind of fully recognised, her contribution was only fully recognised to Suspiria after her death in the press. And then Shellie, you talked about Fangoria and the way in which, you know, I really like that phrase that was mentioned in Fangoria, that it was a Romero-less adaptation. And, you know, correct me if I'm wrong, people may have different understandings of this, but Fangoria always seemed to me a very male perspective. I don't want to be essentialist about it, a very male kind of focused, very quite masculine perspective on horror. Certainly some of its equivalents in the UK, like The Dark Side, I always found to be, you know, primarily aimed at male horror fans. So, I mean, do you think that that's true with somebody like Mary Lambert, that those kind of cultures of horror fandom at the time in places like Fangoria were probably a factor in, or possibly a factor in, her being underappreciated by people, you know, Stephen King fans, people waiting for that particular film to come out?
Yeah, I mean, hopefully this book will be coming out next year, so I'm safe to say in the book what I'm going to do is I've kind of like done a survey of all the Fangorias from the time, and I think it's like what you said is true. I think Fangoria was quite male orientated. You had things like, you know, the centerfold pullouts of Brink Stevens and people like that. You also at the time had, you know, I wasn't alive at the time, but since it's been characterized as this era of the slasher film, which is then characterized as, you know, this overtly misogynistic genre, whether it is or whether it isn't, that's people's kind of, you know, layperson's thoughts about that genre. And you had the Scream Queen, and women's bodies were kind of in a lot of ways reduced to novelty. And just, I think there's Barbara Crampton wrote a really great article, Don't Call Me a Scream Queen, where she says, you know, we were reduced to how strong our lungs were, you know, with the implication being the other things that hang around your lungs. But yeah, I think there was kind of, in Fangoria in, I think it's like 1991, there was this kind of call by the editor at the time, you know, let's put away our sexist notions and start looking at women in the horror genre. And that never really happened in Fangoria. Then in 1992, you get a reader's letter that's like, why are there no women in the Fangoria's Hall of Fame? Why is that? You know, there's all these women that are working in horror and contributing. Why aren't they there? And I think it took Fangoria a long time to catch up. And there is something about the way that they talk about Mary Lambert. When they cover the production of Pet Sematary 2, I think they describe her as a petite blonde about 5 times in 2 pages. Like it's kind of ridiculous. So yeah, I think there's definitely an element of that in there, sure.
Thanks, Shellie. Really interesting.
I can just step in. I mean, I think, yeah, and I think there's a connection between Kate's question and Laura's, in that, you know, the idea of the auteur is, you know, as a kind of romantic model of authorship, and like, there's a really good like John Caldwell piece on like below the line authorship that talks about like credit hoarding, and how the director ends up kind of hoarding the kind of the labor of everyone else who worked on the set as credit, and you know, it's a fun, like the auteur is a fundamentally like masculinist concept that's like shared across academia and journalism. And I don't want to be like journalists are bad, like some of my best friends are from journalists, but like, you know, it's like academics are just as guilty of this actually. A lot of the kind of auteurist, you know, thinking is still completely uncritical. And it completely serves to diminish the work of everyone else, but this is especially, you know, a pertinent kind of feminist issue given the barriers that there are for women actually being able to direct films. And you know, it's also a product of like inequalities that exist within kind of academia and journalism. Like these aren't kind of neutral territories.
Yeah, definitely. I think you're absolutely right, Martha. Thank you.
Thank you. And is that your question answered there, Kate? Are you satisfied?
More than answered. Thank you to both of you. It's really interesting to think about those parallels actually in you know, what's going on in journalism, what goes on in film rather in the film industry is echoed in journalism and in academia. So, you know, there are kind of parallel disparities that occur, and that's evident really from what Martha was saying.
Excellent, thank you. I'm aware we're nearly out of time. We've got like a minute left. So I was going to go to Kelly, who's got a final question, and then we'll wrap things up, I think.
Hi. I was just going to pick up on the Fangoria talk actually,
Oh.
that Kate was just saying and Shellie was just saying. Is everybody aware that Fangoria has just been bought by new people? Yeah. So I think it's really interesting talking about Fangoria in terms of archive right now, because they obviously had scandal recently with what happened at Fangoria, and Fangoria has now been purchased by two young women of colour, and they are very approachable, accessible people. Tara Ainsley, who is one of the owners now, her email is available for people to be able to get in contact with her if you wish to do that, essentially. And I think the interesting part is that they acknowledge the history of what's happened at the magazine, but they are starting a new precedent with the magazine, which is a really interesting thing. And also they are setting up a new film studio as a sister company to the original magazine, which is going to focus on, from what I can gather, women, LGBTQ stories and stories of colour as well. So I think it's something really interesting to kind of track where they're going at the moment. And from what I know, they've inherited the whole archive of Fangoria as well. So they are people to obviously stay in touch with and follow from what I know.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Kelly. And that is a positive note for the future, I feel, to finish on in terms of women and horror film. I would like to thank all of our speakers today and to our audience, both those who have been on the camera and participated in the chat and have just listened and hopefully enjoyed it. Thank you all very much. Have a safe summer. And we'll see you all back in the autumn for a new BAFTSS event. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.